The Apple of Discord, the wedding of Peleus and Thetis. Before the first sword was drawn at the gates of Troy, before the sails of 1,000 ships darkened the Aegean Sea, there was a wedding. And like many great tragedies, it began not with fury or ambition, but with a celebration. In that era, when the gods still walked among mortals, and fate wove its intricate web beneath every feast and blessing, the immortals of Olympus gathered for a rare union, a union that would inadvertently set the world on fire. The bride was Thetis, a sea nymph of ethereal grace and power, daughter of the ancient sea god Nereus. She was more than merely beautiful, though even that word falls short. She was elemental, molded of salt and foam, known for her shape-shifting ability and elusive heart. She was so captivating that Zeus himself once sought her, as did Poseidon, but a prophecy turned their lust to fear. It was foretold that Thetis would bear a son greater than his father, a child destined to surpass whoever sired him. No god dared tempt that fate. And so, to avoid the risk of being overthrown by their own progeny, the gods decreed that she must marry a mortal man. That mortal was Peleus, a hero in his own right, prince of Phthia, and a descendant of Aeacus. Brave, handsome, and favored by the gods. Peleus was not chosen by Thetis, he was chosen for her. The union was arranged, like so many in those days, not for love, but to preserve the balance of power. Thetis resisted at first, turning into fire, water, wind, and beast to escape him. But Peleus held fast, aided by the wisdom of the centaur Chiron. In time, she yielded. And just like that, a sea goddess was bound to a mortal man. Their wedding was held on Mount Pelion, high in Thessaly, and the stars burned cooled and curious. It was no humble celebration. The gods descended from Olympus in full regalia, cloaked in fire and lightning, adorned with golden laurels, their laughter echoing through the mountains. Apollo played the lyre, and the muses sang of destiny and time. Ambrosia flowed like river water, and mortals dared not approach. It was a celebration of rare magnitude, intended to bless the world with heroic lineage, and perhaps, in a way, it did. But amidst the wine, the music, and the divine laughter, a shadow slipped through the feast, a shadow not of mortal doom, but of divine malice. For one goddess was not invited. Her name was Eris, the goddess of discord, strife, and everything that blooms from wounded pride. She was not loved, not even feared, but merely avoided. Wherever she trod, friendships soured, alliances crumbled, and blood stained the earth. Knowing this, Zeus had banned her from the wedding. But gods, even unwelcome ones, do not always stay away. And so Eris arrived uninvited, her steps silent, her presence cold. She did not shout or rampage. Instead, she offered a gift, a golden apple, perfectly round, upon whose surface were inscribed 3 fateful words, "For the fairest." And then, without a word, she vanished. At first, the guests whispered, "An apple, a joke, a curse." But soon the weight of those words began to burn in the minds of the goddesses present. 3 stepped forward. Hera, queen of Olympus and wife of Zeus, regal and severe, the matron of marriage and family. Athena, daughter of Zeus, born fully formed from her father's head, claimed it by merit. She was the goddess of wisdom, justice, heroic warfare, and no one could deny her clarity of mind or her warrior grace. Aphrodite, the youngest of the 3, goddess of beauty and desire, smiled softly, taking her place beside them. Her power was more subtle, more dangerous. Where Hera commanded and Athena calculated, Aphrodite simply was, effortlessly alluring, adored without argument. Zeus, to whom the dispute was brought, saw a storm brewing beneath the veneer of beauty. He was no fool. To choose among them meant provoking disaster, and he would not risk the wrath of either his wife or his daughter. With a cunning smile and a shrug that erased the weight of many prevented wars, he passed the burden on to another. "Let a mortal decide," he declared. "Let a man untouched by Olympus weigh the goddesses and judge." That man was Paris, a Trojan prince by birth, but a shepherd by life. His history was already marked by divine intervention. At his birth, a prophecy foretold that he would bring ruin to Troy. To avoid such a fate, King Priam and Queen Hecuba had him abandoned on Mount Ida, left to die from cold and time. But fate is not so easily undone. A shepherd found the infant and raised him in obscurity. And so Paris grew up not in a palace, but among the flocks, his beauty rivaling that of the gods, his charm already legendary. To Mount Ida arrived Hermes, the swift-footed messenger, carrying the three goddesses and the gleaming apple. Paris, unaware that he was being asked to judge the heavens, stood on the quiet hillside, the air still with the weight of something immense. The goddesses appeared before him in all their glory. Each was a vision of power, grace, and divine splendor. They did not simply stand before him, they made their offers, and in doing so, they laid bare the depths of their ambitions. Hera offered power. If she chose him, she would make him lord of all Asia. His name would be spoken with fear and reverence. Kingdoms would bow and empires would kneel. Athena offered wisdom and victory. She promised him martial glory, eternal fame, and mastery in battle. No army would stand against him. No enemy would outwit him. But Aphrodite spoke neither of war nor of power. She offered something more ancient than either. She offered love. She promised him the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Sparta, daughter of Zeus and Leda, wife of King Menelaus, renowned for her beauty throughout Greece. Aphrodite promised that Helen would be his and that her heart would burn for him alone. Paris, knowing neither throne nor glory, raised among the simple rhythms of a shepherd's life, did not hesitate for long. He gave the apple to Aphrodite. In doing so, he earned her favor, and with it sealed his doom. He also earned the eternal enmity of Hera and Athena, goddesses who would never forgive a slight or forget the consequences. That simple act, performed under the gentle sun of Ida, echoed across oceans and through generations. Paris had judged beauty above power, desire above wisdom, and love above war. But war would come anyway, and somewhere on Olympus, Eris must have smiled. The violation of hospitality, the abduction of Helen. In the city of Sparta, at the edge of the Peloponnesian hills, stood the palace of Menelaus, king of the Lacedaemonians. His throne was not as grand as that of Agamemnon in Mycenae, nor were his armies the largest in Greece, but his house was adorned by a woman whose name was already legend. Helen was more than merely beautiful. She was a myth made flesh, the daughter of Zeus and Leda, born, some say, from an egg after the king of the gods took the form of a swan to seduce or violate her mother, depending on which tale one preferred. Her face, as they would later say, could launch 1,000 ships, but in those days it merely turned heads and stirred jealousy in kingdoms. Helen was courted by many, too many for peace to hold if one were chosen. Princes and warlords came from every corner of Greece, each hoping to claim her as a bride and an ally. To prevent bloodshed and preserve his own standing, Helen's mortal father, Tyndareus, on the advice of the wily Odysseus of Ithaca, forced all the suitors to swear a binding oath. Whomsoever won Helen's hand, the rest would defend that union, and if anyone dared to take her from her husband, all would swear to wage war in the husband's name. That oath, sworn lightly by men still hoping to win her, would one day bind them all to ruin. Menelaus won her hand. He made her queen of Sparta, and by all accounts she was not unhappy. They had a daughter, Hermione. Their life, if not extraordinary, was stable and admired. But then Paris arrived. The Trojan prince came not as a raider or a conqueror, but as a guest, received into Menelaus's home under the sacred laws of Xenia, the bond between host and guest, so holy that even the gods observed it. To violate such a trust was not merely an insult, it was a crime against the divine. However, even beneath Menelaus's roof, with Spartan warriors nearby and the bonds of peace in place, Paris set his sights on Helen, and she did not look away. Many versions exist of what happened next. Some say Aphrodite clouded Helen's mind, swaying her heart toward Paris with a charm. Others contend that Helen left willingly, driven by desire, destiny, or something no one could name. Some later poets would call her a traitor, others a victim of the gods, but no one could deny the event. When Menelaus departed for Crete to attend a funeral, Paris made his move. He spoke soft words, perhaps promises, perhaps illusions. When he left Sparta, Helen went with him. Some say she took treasures from the palace, gold, silk, and ivory ornaments, as if she were not fleeing, but migrating. Ships waited, sleek and silent, on the horizon, and by the time Menelaus returned, they were gone. They sailed to Troy, across the wine-dark sea, past islands and storms, with Aphrodite's favor as the wind in their sails. Behind them, they left not just an empty bed and an outraged king, but a broken oath, a shattered bond, and a question that would tear the Greek world apart. Was Helen stolen, or did she choose? Was she captive or an accomplice? Even then, the answer was unclear. But for Menelaus and for the Greeks who had sworn their fealty, it mattered little. What mattered was that she was gone, abducted, and there could be no peace until she was returned. In Troy, King Priam received Paris with open arms. The city was ancient, mighty, rich in towers and history. Its walls were built by gods. Behind those walls now stood Helen of Sparta, her presence both a prize and a curse. Some among the Trojans rejoiced, blinded by her beauty. Others whispered darkly, foreseeing doom in her arrival. But it was already too late. Across the Aegean, the kings began to stir. Swords were drawn from beneath beds where they had long slept in peace. Ships were hauled to shore and prepared for war. Old oaths were remembered, and old rivalries were rekindled. The oath of the suitors, a broken promise. Helen was in Troy, and Greece would come for her. Perhaps not for love, and not only for honor, but because a promise was broken, and pride is louder than reason. The gods watched in silence. The winds began to change. The war had not yet begun, but it had already become inevitable. Before she was a queen, before her name ran through the mouths of poets and soldiers like a torch through dry grass, Helen was already a figure of desire and consequence. From the moment she came of age, her beauty was no longer merely admired, it was militarized, spoken of with hushed awe or loud defiance in every kingdom of Greece. Kings, princes, warlords, and heroes sailed to Sparta, not for conquest or treaty, but for a chance to court the daughter of Zeus. She was not merely the fairest of mortal women. She was the child of a god and the gem of the Spartan lineage. To win her hand was to gain not only a powerful alliance, but a measure of divine favor. To lose her, as was feared, could mean civil war. Tyndareus, the mortal king of Sparta and Helen's legal father, stood at the center of a storm he was powerless to stop. Dozens of suitors arrived, bearing gifts, boasting of their exploits, each more impatient than the last. Among them were names that would one day shape the world. Menelaus of Mycenaean blood, brother to the mighty Agamemnon. Odysseus of Ithaca, cunning and quick-witted, relying more on brain than brawn. Ajax of Salamis, massive as a mountain and slow to smile. Diomedes, daring and pragmatic. Even Palamedes, destined to briefly outshine Odysseus in wisdom and invention. Every man sought her favor, and none were willing to yield the prize to another. Tyndareus, for all his power, found himself paralyzed. If he chose one suitor, he would offend all the others. If he delayed, the tension would explode into violence. He stood not as a king, but as a man guarding a powder keg. And so he did what the wise often do when faced with a problem greater than themselves. He listened. It was Odysseus who spoke the answer. The king of Ithaca knew his own chances of winning Helen were slim, and so he made a bargain. He asked for the hand of Tyndareus's niece, Penelope, and in return offered a solution that would spare Sparta from bloodshed. Tyndareus agreed, and Odysseus proposed the oath. "Let every suitor," Odysseus said, "swear a solemn pledge. They will defend Helen's chosen husband. They will stand by him if anyone ever attempts to steal her or threaten the bonds of marriage. In exchange for this oath, they would accept the final choice and leave Sparta in peace." One by one, the suitors agreed. Perhaps they believed the oath would never be tested. Perhaps they believed Helen would choose wisely, or that fate would never tempt such a violation. But they swore nonetheless. Their hands were raised, their words echoed in the still Spartan air. Helen chose Menelaus. He was not the most powerful or the most brilliant, but he was of good stock, and his claim was honorable. The others accepted it, some bitterly, some with feigned grace. They returned to their homes and their wars, to their wives and their councils, the oath already receding into memory. But oaths are living things. They wait. They sleep like seeds beneath the earth, untouched until a storm or a fire forces them to bloom. When Paris carried Helen away from Sparta, when the ship slipped out under the cloak of night, and the sun rose on an empty bed, that ancient oath awoke, and with it the long road to war began to rise from the dust. The call to war. Agamemnon and Menelaus. When Menelaus returned from Crete and crossed the threshold of his palace, he found silence waiting for him. Not the gentle silence of evening, but the cold void of absence. The hearth was cold, the chambers abandoned, and the queen's guard stood in confusion and shame. Servants whispered of ships seen on the horizon, and of foreign hands hastily gathering treasures. There had been no battle, no struggle, no bloodshed, but Helen was gone, and with her Paris of Troy, the guest to whom he had offered his roof, his table, and his peace. Menelaus stood stunned. He had not only lost a wife, he had lost her to a man who had shared his salt, drunk his wine, and slept under his protection. This was not merely an insult. It was a violation of the sacred code that bound mortals and gods. The law of Xenia, honored across all Greece, was ripped apart in his own home. For a man of pride, the wound was unbearable. For a king, it was a call to action. He did not delay. From Sparta he rode to Mycenae, where his brother Agamemnon ruled in wealth and iron, a king of greater influence and darker ambition. Though their blood was the same, the two men were different as storm and stillness. Agamemnon was a warlord by nature, always looking to expand his influence, to unite the squabbling Greek kingdoms under one banner, his own. Helen's abduction offered not only a cause for vengeance, but a pretext for conquest. And so when Menelaus stood before his brother and spoke of Paris, of Troy, and the oath sworn by Helen's former suitors, Agamemnon listened with growing interest. Together they summoned the kings of Greece. Messengers were dispatched to every shore and island. Horsemen rode through olive groves and mountain passes. From Pylos to Argos, from Ithaca to Thebes, the call went out. The suitors who had once sworn their swords in peace were now called to fulfill their word in war. The oath that had slept in comfort now demanded a sacrifice. Some answered immediately, eager for glory, duty, or the sheer thrill of battle. Others hesitated, bound by their own troubles, or wary of a distant vengeance. Not all were ready. Not all believed Helen was worth the blood of thousands. But the oath held. It had power. It had been sworn in sacred trust, and to break it would be to stain not only a man's honor, but his legacy. Reputation was no small thing in the Greek world. It was the shield against time, the echo a man left behind when his bones turned to dust. And so they came. Ships were prepared, armor was reforged, young men were conscripted from the fields and halls, told they would sail to a city they had never seen, for a queen they had never met. And behind it all stood Menelaus, cold with rage, and Agamemnon, already imagining not only the rescue of his brother's wife, but the coronation of himself as the supreme king of all Greece. But the road to Troy would not be swift. Heroes still hid. Prophecies were yet to be fulfilled. The gods, though watching, had not yet taken sides. The winds remained still. The storm was gathering, but its full force had yet to break. The unmasking and the cost of war. Odysseus and Achilles. Palamedes, sent by Agamemnon to recruit him, saw through the pretense. He placed Telemachus, Odysseus's infant son, directly in the path of the plow. Odysseus stopped instantly, his madness dispelled, his mask cast off. And though he did not weep, those close enough to see him said there was a sorrow in his eyes that no poem could fully capture. He left his home, he kissed his wife and held his son, and he boarded the ship that would take him from Ithaca. Though he would one day return, that journey would become the stuff of legend, a second Odyssey to match the first. But that story was still far in the future. For now, Odysseus committed himself to a war he did not choose, and he would not return the same man who left. Achilles was a different story entirely. If Odysseus was the mind of the Greeks, Achilles was their fire. Born of a mortal king and a sea goddess, raised in the cave of the centaur Chiron, he was swift, shining and deadly. Even as a child, he had the look of a hero from an older age. Yet his mother, Thetis, wise and prophetic, knew too well what the war would demand. It was foretold that Achilles would either live a long life in obscurity or die young and have his name remembered forever. And Thetis, like any mother, wanted her son to live. To hide him from the war, she sent him to the island of Skyros, where he was disguised as a girl and hidden among the daughters of King Lycomedes. There he lived in the shadow, away from the world's eye, even as the fires of Troy began to smolder distantly. But fate and Odysseus came for him anyway. Arriving at Skyros disguised as a merchant, Odysseus laid out a myriad of goods before the king's daughters. Among the trinkets and garments, he placed a sword and a spear. While the women admired the silks and golden combs, one reached not for the bracelets, but for the blade. That hand was no maiden's. It belonged to Achilles. Shedding the disguise, Achilles did not hesitate. The call of war awoke something fierce within him. He was born for this moment. He would go to Troy, though he knew the cost. He would win a glory that would never fade, though his life would burn fast and be gone. Thetis wept, but could not stop him. No goddess, however powerful, can unweave what the fates have spun. With Achilles came his companion, Patroclus, an exile from his own land for blood he had spilled, but bound to Achilles by a love stronger than brotherhood. Together they joined the gathering host at Aulis, where the ships waited on the shore, and the omens whispered through the windless sky. And so the final two figures were placed on the board, the mind and the might, the cunning of Ithaca and the fury of Thea. The war had its heroes. The gods, in silence, had chosen their sides, and yet the sea held its breath. The storm was ready, though the first wave had yet to break. The sacrifice of Iphigenia, the wrath of Artemis. The ships stood waiting at Aulis. Row upon row of black hulls hauled onto the beach, sails furled, masts rising like a forest of dead trees against the sky. Thousands of warriors were assembled, kings and their armies, servants and soothsayers, horses and weapons, all gathered with purpose and fury. But the sea remained still. The winds did not come. Days turned to weeks, and the tide did not shift. The warriors gazed at the horizon. The soldiers grew restless. The gods seemed to have turned away. Then came Calchas, the high priest and seer, his eyes clouded with visions of Apollo. He told them that the goddess Artemis had been offended, her wrath stirred by blood and arrogance. Some say Agamemnon had boasted that he was a better hunter than the goddess herself. Others speak of a sacred stag killed at her altar, or a prayer left unsaid. The reason mattered little. Artemis's silence had become the chain that shackled the ships to the sand. And only blood, the seer said, could break it. The winds would not return unless Agamemnon gave his daughter to the goddess. Her name was Iphigenia. Agamemnon, who called all of Greece to arms, who claimed the mantle of supreme king, and who sought eternal glory, now stood faced with a choice that would haunt his name forever. To defy the gods and see the army scatter, the war ruined before it began, or to sacrifice his own blood to appease the deity. There was no right choice, only consequences. He sent for her under a lie. A letter was written to Clytemnestra, queen of Mycena, calling mother and daughter to Aulis under the pretense of a wedding. Achilles, the letter claimed, would take Iphigenia as his wife. The gods blessed the union. The union would bless the war effort. There was rejoicing in the palace at the news, and Iphigenia came willingly, dressed in white, her hair bound with ribbons, dreaming of love and honor. But no wedding altar awaited her. There was only the pit and the blade, and the heavy silence of soldiers who could not meet her gaze. When the truth was revealed, some say she wept. Others say she stood tall and proud, that she understood the weight of her sacrifice and accepted it, like a heroine of old. There are those who claim Artemis spared her at the last moment, whisking her away in a cloud and placing a deer on the altar instead. But this is a gentler tale, one meant for children and bards. What most believe, what the winds remember, is that she died for the sake of the war, that her father gave his daughter to the gods so he could lead 1,000 ships to Troy. And with her blood, the winds returned. They came first as a whisper, then as a mounting roar. Sails were hoisted, anchors raised. The Greek army finally moved. The sea was now open before them. War was no longer a promise, but a certainty. Behind them, the shore of Aulis vanished in the mist. Before them, the towers of Troy stood waiting. 1,000 ships and the first errors. Finally, the winds rose over Aulis. They came not with a sudden fury, but a long sigh that stirred the sea like a sleeper waking from troubled dreams. The sails filled slowly at first, then billowed with force. The air smelled of salt and distant promises. 1,000 ships, more than any army had ever gathered under a single purpose, now lined the shore like an invasion of shadows. Their hulls were coated in dark pitch. Their oars were strong and numerous, their prows carved into lions, eagles, and snarling beasts. And in every vessel waited men destined soon to become dust and legend. The war began not with fire, but with a girl's last breath. Now that the debt was paid and the sea was moving, the fleet set forth. It was a sight few would ever see again in their lives. Kings stood on their decks, their eyes narrowed against the glare of the open water. Soldiers whispered prayers to gods they barely trusted. Some wept for home. Others gripped their spears and thought only of glory. They came from every island and shore of Greece, rough men from the north, nimble-armed fighters from the Aegean coasts, seasoned lords of cities that now exist only in the fading lines of song. Leading the fleet was Agamemnon, the high king of Mycenae. His ship was marked with a crimson banner, his eyes set on a future soaked in ambition. Menelaus sailed beside him, not with a thirst for power, but with the heavy rage of a slighted husband. Odysseus kept to himself, his eyes scanning the horizon as if he was already plotting the route home. Nestor, old and calm, murmured lessons of old wars to the youth near him. Ajax, the greater, stood on the prow of his ship like a living statue, immobile and ready. Diomedes polished his armor with grim resolve, and Achilles, barely more than a boy, burned with a restless energy, golden and reckless, a promise of death wrapped in beauty. The journey to Troy was not seamless. The sea, though now open, was not always kind. Storms blew in from the east and scattered portions of the fleet. Some ships were thrown far off course. Some were wrecked on alien shores. The army did not land simultaneously, and those who first reached Asia did so without clear knowledge of the land or its people. In one instance, they mistook the shores of Mysia for Troy and attacked, only to be met with the fierce resistance of King Telephus. He fought bravely and wounded Achilles before being struck down. His wound, touched by the very spear that inflicted it, would not heal, and only later would he learn that the cure lay within the same weapon. But this part of the story, like so many in this war, would unfold with time. When the Greeks finally reached the coast of Troy, they found not a defenseless port, but a fortified kingdom, surrounded by thick stone walls, gates forged with ancient skill, and towers that watched the sea with wariness and suspicion. Troy did not tremble. It did not panic. It had heard the whispers on the wind. Its people had seen the omens in the flight of birds and the quiet anxiety of the dogs. They had heard that Helen was the spark, but not the fire. The Greeks landed not in secret, but with a roar. They beached their ships and raised their banners. They formed ranks and let their battle horns cry across the hills. The Trojans answered not with surrender, but with their own heroes. Hector stood tall among them, the proud son of Priam, the city's defender, the lion of his people. Paris, whose desire had lit the fuse, watched from behind him, bow in hand, his heart beating faster than he would care to admit. And above them all, the gods looked down from Olympus, their attention finally drawn to the mortal drama unfolding below. The war had come. It would not be quick, it would not be clean, but it had begun. And all the old oaths, the ancient grudges, and the dreams of men were now bound to it. The storm had broken. The healing of Telephus and the arrival. The war had not yet begun in earnest, but blood had already been spilled. The sea, once still and unwilling, had delivered the Greek fleet to distant shores. Though not all voyages ended where they were destined, the ships were many and the coastline vast. Among the first to land were those who had mistaken Mysia for Troy. And it was there, on foreign soil and against a king who bore no guilt, that the first true skirmish of the campaign unfolded. Mysia lay inland from the Aegean, a proud and fertile region ruled by King Telephus, a son of Heracles. His people lived in peace, far from the intrigues of Troy, untouched by the crime of Paris. And yet, when the Greeks swept ashore, seeing alien walls in the distance and believing it to be the fabled city of Priam, they did not wait for confirmation. Their swords were drawn, the land was ravaged, village fires were lit. And so Telephus answered. He met the invaders not with pleas or surrender, but with the fury of a warrior king, a descendant of divine blood. Seated on his chariot, spear in hand, he cut through the Greek ranks with terrifying speed. Few could match him in open combat. The Greeks, taken by surprise by the resistance, faltered in their advance. In the chaos, Achilles stepped forward. The son of Peleus met Telephus on the field. Two young men of noble lineage and fire-forged blood. Their blades flashed under the rising sun. They clashed in a tempest of bronze and rage. In the struggle, Achilles drove his spear into Telephus's thigh, tearing the flesh and sending the king tumbling to the dust. The Greeks retreated, realizing their error, and returned to their ships. The wound, however, lingered. Deep and strange, it would not close. No herb could heal it. No physician could ease it. Days turned to pain, and the ache worsened. Telephus wandered in a fever, strength draining from his limbs, his pride heavy as iron. His priests and advisors whispered that no mortal cure would work. The spear that pierced him was not just a weapon, it was touched by destiny, and only the thing that wounded him could restore him. And so Telephus sailed, not as a king returning with victory, but as a suppliant, crawling to the feet of the enemy. He arrived at the Greek camp in disguise, hooded and limping, and found Agamemnon and Odysseus sitting in war council. There, before the very men who had burned his villages and spilled his blood, Telephus laid down his sword and begged not for mercy, but for life. The gift of Telephus and the siege of Troy. It was Calchas, the seer, who spoke the truth. The wound could only be healed by the hand or the weapon that inflicted it. Achilles, hearing this, agreed to help, not out of cruelty or guilt,
but because he understood the weight of prophecy and the bonds of fate. Scraping the rust from the tip of his spear, he applied it to the wound. The bleeding stopped, the skin began to knit, and Telephus stood whole again. Gratitude in the ancient world was never offered lightly, especially by kings. In exchange for the healing, Telephus promised knowledge. Though he held no loyalty to Troy, he knew the lay of the land, the tides, the inlets, and the roads. He would guide the Greek fleet, show them the true path, and in doing so, finally lead them to the gates of Troy. Thus, the Greeks learned their first lesson of the war. Not all battles would be won by might. Not every enemy would remain an enemy, and not every road to Troy would be straight. Even now, the gods watched. Even now, the web was tightening, and the war, though young, was learning to speak with the voice of tragedy. Guided at last by Telephus, the Greeks raised their sails toward the shores of Troy, not in haste, but with a solemn heaviness. The sea stretched wide and endless before them, but the coastlines no longer deceived them. They passed the familiar bays and headlands and sailed into waters they had only heard about in tales. At the mouth of the Scamander River, where the land rose to slopes and the horizon opened to reveal a glimpse of high stone walls, they saw Troy for the first time. The city stood proud on the plain, its towers tall and unyielding, its gates shut but unafraid. Smoke rose from its hearths, and its banners flew against the pale sky, untouched by fear. The Greeks had finally arrived, but Troy did not flinch. The landing was swift and brutal. The beach was open, but the defense was not idle. The Trojans had watched the horizon and seen the sails long before the keels scraped the sand. Their archers rained arrows upon the shore, and their heroes sallied forth with spear and shield to meet the invaders before they could establish a foothold. The first to fall was Protesilaus, lord of Phylake, who leapt from his ship before all others, eager to be the first to touch Trojan soil. In doing so, he fulfilled the prophecy that the first Greek to step on the land would be the first to die. His death was remembered not for the battle it marked, but for the omen it carried. This would not be a swift campaign. The gods had taken their toll from the start. The Greeks pressed inland and fought the outer defenses, but Troy itself remained closed to them. The walls, ancient and massive, were said to be built by divine hands. Some whispered by Poseidon himself. Behind them, Priam ruled with wisdom and sorrow, and Hector stood ready, the pride of his people, beloved by all. Paris, whose desire had brought this fire to their gates, lurked in the shadow of the palace, handsome and hesitant, his bow untouched in its case. Helen stood upon the walls and looked down upon the men who were once her countrymen. She spoke little. No one knew what her eyes expressed. The Greeks, unable to take the city by storm, turned to the countryside. And so began the long war, not with the thunder of siege towers, but with raids and fire. Cities allied with Troy were sacked, fertile fields were burned, shepherds killed, and temples plundered. The Greeks established their camp along the coast and sent their warriors into the surrounding lands. This was not a war of glory, but a war of attrition. The cities of Kilcia and Phrygia felt the wrath of Achilles and his Myrmidons, swift and ruthless. Briseis, the maiden who would soon become the symbol of pride and fury, was captured during one of these raids. Her fate was sealed long before she stepped into the Greek camp. For 9 years the war dragged on, not against Troy itself, but against its allies and vassals. Troy stood like a rock in the tide, untouched, while the world around it bled. The Greeks grew restless. Heroes grew in fame or fell into obscurity. Some, like Ajax, proved themselves in open combat. Others, like Odysseus, schemed in secret. and others like Achilles shone with such ferocious brilliance that even the gods watched with anxiety. The war had begun in earnest, but its heart still beat outside the gates of Troy. The plains ran red with blood, and yet the walls endured.
The rage of Achilles. The quarrel with Agamemnon. By the 10th year of the war, the plain before Troy had become a graveyard for heroes. The city walls still held firm, and the Greeks, for all their ships and swords, had yet to breach them. The tide of battle shifted with the seasons. Some years brought skirmishes and victories. Others were filled with disease and windless days. The gods gave and withheld their favor, like gamblers tossing dice onto a table. And in the long shadow of this unbroken stalemate, passions ran hot, rivalries deepened, and pride began to fester. Among the Greeks, no name burned brighter than Achilles, son of Peleus and the sea goddess Thetis. No man could match his speed in battle or his fury in a clash. His myrmidons, fierce and loyal, followed him like hounds after a lion. When Achilles took the field, men died quickly, and cities fell in his wake. He had sacked 12 fortresses along the coast and brought their spoils back to the camp, caring little for strategy or politics. He fought not for Agamemnon or Menelaus, but for glory, for his own legend, and for the unspoken knowledge that his time in the world would be brief. It was during one of these raids that Briseis was captured, a princess of Lyrnessus, wife of a slain priest and a woman of noble blood. She was given to Achilles as a prize. But what began as a spoil of war soon became something more. Achilles kept her in his tent not as a servant, but as a companion, and men whispered that the great warrior had found an affection, even a tenderness, within the fury that so often consumed him. Briseis spoke little, and history does not record her feelings with certainty. But those who saw them together said that Achilles softened in her presence, as if some part of him remembered the world before the war. Agamemnon, meanwhile, sat sullenly in the heart of the camp. Though he was the supreme king and commander of all Greek forces, he knew his command rested uneasily on the shoulders of men who did not love him. His pride was immense, but his greatness was not absolute. He envied Achilles, resented the love the soldiers bore him, and feared the way his glory threatened to eclipse that of all other Greeks. When his own prize, the daughter of a Trojan priest named Chrysis, was taken from him by the will of Apollo, Agamemnon's rage turned not on the gods, but on the one man in the camp he could not control. He demanded Briseis. The act was bold and cruel, not because he desired the maiden, but because he wished to wound Achilles' pride.
and the wound was deep. Achilles did not draw his sword, though many feared he would. He did not strike Agamemnon, though his hand trembled with the desire to do so. Instead, he withdrew. He left the battlefield and retreated to his ships. He swore he would not raise his spear again in this war, not for Helen, not for Agamemnon, not for any cause born of lies and arrogance. Without Achilles, the Greeks faltered. They did not know it yet, but they had lost more than a warrior. They had lost their fire. And in the silence that followed his retreat, the war began to shift. The balance tilted, and the gods, watching from Olympus, began to smile. The fire of Hector and the refusal of Achilles. Years had worn down the men, but pride had not softened. In the shadow of the stalemate, bitterness grew, and even the mightiest warriors began to turn away from the war they had once pursued like a dream. With Achilles' retreat to his tent and the idleness of the Myrmidons beside the ships, the war descended into a strange silence. The Greeks still held their camp on the beach and sent out small raids into the countryside, but the heart of their army no longer beat with force. The Trojans, sensing the shift, began to press outward beyond their walls. Where once they had remained cautious, they now grew bolder. Skirmishes flared along the plain, and more than once the Greeks were driven back toward the sea, their fortifications tested, their resolve questioned. The absence of Achilles was not unnoticed in the halls of Troy. Priam, old and wise, urged caution. He had lived long enough to know that fortune changes faster than the wind on the water. But Hector, his eldest son and the city's greatest defender, saw in the retreat an opportunity to press the enemy, to remind the Greeks that Troy still had teeth. Hector held no illusions about the war. He did not seek it, nor did he find joy in killing. He fought for his city, for his wife Andromache and their young son Astyanax, for the old king who still sat on the throne, and for the gods who watched silently from the heights of Mount Ida. With Achilles gone from the field, Hector struck with swift precision. He led charges not just against the Greek lines, but deep into the enemy's morale. To stem this rising threat, the Greeks turned to diplomacy. Odysseus, the perpetual master of words, was sent with Phoenix and Ajax to plead with Achilles. They found him in his tent, surrounded by silence, his armor untouched, his spear leaned against the wall like a relic of a forgotten self. He listened as they spoke. He heard their arguments, their flattery, their promises of wealth and glory. They begged him to return, to save the Greeks from ruin, to restore the honor that Agamemnon had stolen. But Achilles, though moved, would not rise. He spoke of betrayal, of a heart chilled by insult, of a war no longer worth the blood spilled. He would not fight, not for Agamemnon, and perhaps not even for Greece. Meanwhile, the war outside his tent grew more brutal. Without Achilles, the Greeks were vulnerable, and the Trojans grew bolder. Sarpedon, son of Zeus and king of Lycia, arrived with his forces and struck terror into the enemy lines. He fought like a man who knew the hour of his death, but did not care for it. Aeneas also proved himself, cousin to Hector and Paris, and a warrior who would one day carry the last ember of Troy far to the west. The gods took sides in secret and in the open. Athena guided the spears of the Greeks. Apollo stood beside the Trojans. Hera whispered rage into the hearts of commanders. Artemis and Ares chose their favorites without warning. The battlefield became a gaming board, and the men were pieces moved by divine hands. Casualties mounted in both camps. Young men who had come for glory now lay nameless in the dust. Ships that once cut the Aegean Sea like birds in the wind now served as funeral pyres. The plains around Troy grew thick with blood and salt and the smell of unsung sorrow. The Greeks lost many, and the Trojans grieved just as deeply. Brothers fell beside brothers. Heroes were cut down before their names could be fully remembered. The war was no longer a tale of gleaming shields and noble jewelry. It had become a long decomposition.
The withdrawal and the grief, Patroclus and the rage. All this time, Achilles remained apart, his grief and rage sealed in silence. He walked the shore at dawn, speaking to no one. And inside Troy, Helen looked from the walls, her eyes tracing the lines of the horizon, looking for something no one could name. Years had passed since Paris carried her from Sparta. The song still called her the cause of the war, but those close to her saw something else. Not a seductress, but a captive. Not a prize, but a wound that refused to close. She moved through the palace like a ghost, speaking quietly to Priam, keeping her distance from Paris, and listening to the names of the dead with a look that never changed. The war had not yet reached its climax, but its weight lay upon the land like ashes. Heroes still stood, and gods still watched. But both sides were beginning to understand what war they were truly fighting. Not a swift campaign for honor and retribution, but a slow erosion of pride, a hunger that could not be sated, a fire that would not go out. And away from the walls of Troy, deep in the heart of the greatest warrior Greece had ever known, something dark stirred. It began not with a shout, not with a sword in the hand, but with silence. Achilles, son of Thetis and prince of Phthia, had withdrawn from the fighting, and with him went the hope of a quick victory. The Myrmidons remained idle by their ships, their black armor polished and unused, while their commander walked the shore alone. Every step a quiet rebellion against a war he had once pursued with fire in his blood. The Greeks pleaded for his return, but their pleas fell like waves on stone. He would not raise his spear. He would not fight for the king who had dishonored him. For Achilles, glory was nothing without pride, and his pride had been stripped away. In the camp, the Greeks faltered. Hector and the Trojans pressed hard against their lines. The gods granted strength to the city's defenders, and the tide of the war shifted again. Where once the Greeks had dominated the plain, they were now pushed back toward the sea. Even the ships, the great vessels that had carried them across the wine-dark waters, now lay under threat of fire and storm. Agamemnon, proud and angry, watched his army bend under the weight of his own folly. Yet he would not yield to Achilles, not entirely, and so the Greeks continued to fight, weakened and desperate. It was Patroclus who could not watch any longer, Achilles' friend and companion, bound by an affection deeper than most men knew how to speak. He had sat by him through the long days of idleness, through the restless pacing and the rage that cooled into sadness. But Patroclus was not built for idleness. He saw the dying, heard the shouts on the ramparts, and watched the Trojans close in with every day. At last he went to Achilles and fell to his knees. "Let me wear your armor," he said. "Let me lead the Myrmidons. The Trojans will believe you have returned. The mere sight of your shield will drive them back. I do not ask you to fight, only to let me stand in your stead." Achilles hesitated. He looked at his friend and saw both courage and the shadow of fate. He knew from his boyhood that his own end would come before the war was complete. He did not foresee this, but he consented. He gave Patroclus his armor, his horses, and the command of the Myrmidons. He warned him, "Do not pursue them to the gates, drive them from the ships, but go no further.
Patroclus drove out, shining like a morning star. The Myrmidons followed him with a roar, and the Trojans, thinking Achilles himself had returned, broke ranks in fear. The Greek camp rallied, the ships were saved, the lines were restored. Patroclus, burning with a borrowed fire, pressed forward. He forgot the warning. He pursued the Trojans across the plain, through the bloody dirt and shattered shields, until he finally stood beneath the walls of Troy. There he met Hector. Vengeance and grief. The duel with Hector. When the body was brought back, silence returned. But it was no longer the silence of withdrawal. It was the silence before a storm, before the world would be broken and remade in fire. Achilles wept. He threw dust upon his head and fell beside his friend's body. He wept not as a hero, but as a man. There was no pride left, no resentment for Agamemnon, only grief, cold and vast, and a slowly burning retribution that could not be denied. He rose, called his mother Thetis from the sea, and asked for new armor. He would return to battle. He would not live long, but before he died, Hector would fall, and all the fury of the gods could not prevent it. Hephaestus, the smith of Olympus, forged a shield for Achilles unlike any seen before or since. Upon its surface were engraved the labors of men, the songs of harvest and war, the stillness of cities, and the chaos of storms. It was not merely a shield, but the world made of bronze. With it, Achilles returned to the field, and the earth shook beneath his feet. He fought not for Helen, and not for Greece, but for Patroclus. His spear found every Trojan it sought. Men fled before him as before a god. The Scamander River rose against him, insulted by the bodies that choked its banks. But even the waters could not stop him. He raged like fire, like a curse that could not be lifted. At last he met Hector beneath the walls of Troy. The duel was unlike the duels of old, where honor guided the spear. Hector stood his ground, but he knew his end had come. 3 times they circled the city. 3 times Hector fled, until finally Athena, disguised as Hector's brother, tricked him and halted his flight. He turned and faced Achilles head-on. The two clashed under the cold gaze of the gods, and Achilles dealt the killing blow, driving his spear through the collarbone. Even then, Hector spoke with dignity. He pleaded that his body be returned to his family, that it not be desecrated. But Achilles, lost in his fury, refused. He tied Hector's corpse to his chariot and dragged it through the dirt before the weeping eyes of the city. He had avenged Patroclus, but he had also crossed the line that separated men from beasts. Days passed. The rage cooled, though the grief remained. It was only when old Priam, king of Troy and father of Hector, came alone into the Greek camp, unarmed and weeping, that Achilles' heart was touched again. The old man knelt before him, kissed his hands, and begged for the return of his son's body. "Think of your own father," he said. "Think of what it is to love a child and lose him." And Achilles, in that moment, saw the truth. He wept again and returned Hector's body. And for a brief time the war paused, but it would not end, not yet. Too much had been done. Too many lights still burned. Achilles had found his rage, and soon he would meet his fate. The shield of peace and the rage of retribution. The god forged a shield unlike any the world had ever seen. Upon its surface were engraved not just emblems of war, but of peace and cities and harvest and the full circle of mortal life. It was a shield for a man who was never destined to see such things again. Achilles took the armor. He strode before the Greeks, shining and terrible, and declared that the time for silence was over. Patroclus would be avenged. The war would burn again, and Troy would tremble under the weight of his rage. And the gods, watching from above, said nothing. The dawn that followed Patroclus's death was unlike any before it. It came not with hope, but with the heavy silence of a battlefield that knew what was coming. The Greeks stirred in their tents and sharpened their spears, but their eyes always turned to one figure. Achilles stood at the edge of the camp, staring across the plain toward the walls of Troy. The man who had once refused to fight now burned with purpose. He returned to the war not for gold or honor, and not to redeem Agamemnon's slight. He returned for vengeance, and vengeance would be his sole guide. The new armor shone with a divine fire. Hephaestus, the smith of Olympus, had forged it not only with skill, but with the knowledge that it would soon be soaked with blood. The shield bore images of life untouched by war, a cruel irony in the hands of a man who had nothing left but war itself. When Achilles fastened it to his arm, it was as if the old world fell away and only destiny remained. He did not wait for permission. He did not summon a council or speak to the kings. He walked onto the field like a man entering his own funeral, fearless and alone. The Trojans saw him from their towers, and terror spread through their ranks like fire through dry grass. Before he even struck a blow, they felt the weight of his return. He was not just a warrior. He was a storm held back by the gods, now finally unleashed. Achilles led the charge, and the Myrmidons followed without question. The plain erupted in violence. Trojan chariots turned and fled. Men who had stood firm against 10 years of siege now faltered at the sight of a single man. His spear found every Trojan it sought. He moved not in fury, but with a cold precision. There was no mercy in him. He sought one name, but all who stood in his path were swept away like dust before the wind. He found Aeneas and spared him only at the urging of the gods. He found Lycoon, a son of Priam, whom he had once captured and sold into slavery. The boy had returned to Troy only to meet the same man who had once let him live. This time, Achilles did not. He struck him down without hesitation, unmoved by the boy's tears or pleas. He killed Tros at the altar. He choked the river with corpses until the waters rose in anger, and the god Scamander himself rose up against him. Even then, Achilles did not yield. He fought the river as he fought men, fearless and relentless, until the gods dragged him away from the rising torrent. The Greeks rejoiced, but no one more than Achilles. He became what he was always destined to be, not a king, not a husband, but a weapon honed by grief and guided by the will of fate. And at the heart of his rage was one name, Hector. The prince of Troy had retreated behind the gates, urging his people to pull back, to live and fight another day. But the city was in chaos. The sons of Priam lay dead in the dust, and the plain outside the walls was stained with blood. Hector knew what was coming. He put on his armor, kissed his wife Andromache, and lifted his son Astyanax into the air one last time. She begged him not to face Achilles. She spoke not of glory, but of the life they had built, the quiet garden in the palace, the games their son played in the courtyard. But Hector had no choice. He was the shield of Troy, and without him, the city would fall. He walked out onto the plain alone and stood beneath the walls. Achilles saw him, and his steps slowed. Here, at last, was the man who had taken Patroclus. The two locked gazes, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Then Hector turned and ran. Around the walls of Troy they circled, not once, but 3 times. Hector's courage failed him, and his feet betrayed him, but the gods would not let the chase last forever. Athena appeared, disguised as Hector's brother, and urged him to stop, promising aid. Tricked and cornered, Hector turned and faced his enemy. The duel was swift and inevitable. Hector fought bravely, but Achilles was beyond mortal strength. The spear flew true, and Hector fell. Dying, he begged not for life, but for dignity. He said, "Return my body to my father. Let me be buried with honor." But Achilles had not yet returned to himself. His grief still drove him. He refused. He tied Hector's body to his chariot and dragged it through the dust before the eyes of Troy. Andromache screamed from the walls. Priam wept in silence. Paris said nothing. Helen turned away. That night, Achilles hosted the funeral games for Patroclus. He lit the pyre himself. He tossed the long hair he had grown into the flames and wept as the body burned. The Greeks gathered to compete in chariot races and spear throws, but no celebration could ease the heaviness of what had been lost. Achilles had avenged Patroclus, but he had found no peace. The body of Hector still lay unburied.
Mercy and the end of rage. It was not until Priam, aged and bent with grief, secretly entered the Greek camp, unarmed and weeping, that the final act of rage was brought to a close. The old king knelt before his son's killer, kissed his hands, and spoke the simplest truth. "I have done what no man should do. I have kissed the hands of the man who killed my child." Achilles looked at him and saw not a king, but a father. He thought of Peleus, old and waiting in Thea, and he broke. He wept again for Patroclus, for Hector, for the boy he once was. He returned the body. He washed it with his own hands. He gave it back to Priam and promised 12 days of peace for the funeral rites. That night, in the silence of his tent, Achilles wept again, for Patroclus, for Hector, for the boy he once was. He knew his time was short. He knew the gods would come for him. But for a moment, there was peace. The war paused. The fires burned low, and across the plains of Troy, even the winds seemed to mourn. The plains of Troy had known no silence for many years, but after the death of Hector, the battlefield fell into a hush. The clang of swords, the whistle of arrows, the thunder of hooves on shattered earth all subsided. The Greeks stood behind their walls of shipwood, and the Trojans watched from their towers, but neither side lifted their arms. It was not a truce sealed by words or treaties, but one born from the weight of sorrow. Even war must rest when its greatest defenders lie cold and unburied. In the Greek camp, Achilles remained by Patroclus's pyre. The fire burned for hours, the smoke rising into the sky, carrying the soul of his dearest companion to the realm that awaited the honored dead. Ash clung to Achilles' skin, and his eyes were red from weeping. Around him, the warriors of Greece moved quietly, speaking in hushed tones. Funeral games were held, and spoils of war were distributed as prizes, but nothing could lift the shadow that had fallen over the camp. Achilles had avenged Patroclus, but he had found no peace. Hector's body still lay in his tent, bound and bruised, and each morning Achilles would rise and drag it behind his chariot around his friend's tomb. And yet the body did not rot. Day after day, Achilles desecrated the corpse, and yet Hector's flesh would not decay. Apollo protected it with divine light, preserving the face of Troy's fallen champion, as if to remind the Greeks that even in death,
Hector remained a prince. The gods began to turn away from Achilles, not in judgment, but in sadness. Even Zeus, who watched the war with a detachment and amusement, now stirred. The time for rage had to end. That end came in the quietest of ways. Late at night, an old man rode into the Greek camp alone. Priam, king of Troy, father of Hector, passed through the gates unseen, guided by Hermes himself. He was unarmed, wrapped in simple robes, his beard gray with age, his back bent by the weight of years and sorrow. He carried no threats, no arguments, and no gold worth the blood of 10 years. He carried the memory of a son and the courage that only grief can summon. He found Achilles in his tent, alone with his sorrow. The warrior did not rise when the old man entered. He did not call the guard or draw his sword. He looked at Priam and saw not an enemy, but something far more painful, a mirror. Priam knelt before him, bowed his head, and kissed the hands that had killed his son. "I have done what no man should do. I have kissed the hands of the man who killed my child." Achilles said nothing for a long time. The silence stretched like a wound. Then he wept. He wept for Hector, whom he had wronged. He wept for Patroclus, whom he had lost. He wept for his own father, Peleus, waiting far away in Thea, who would never see his son return. The grief of the old and the young mingled in that quiet tent, and for the first time since the ships landed on Trojan shores, there was something akin to mercy. Achilles rose and lifted Priam from the ground. He washed Hector's body with his own hands. He anointed it with oil and wrapped it in linen. He returned the Prince of Troy to his father, not as a trophy, but as a man who had fought and died with honor. He promised 12 days of peace for the funeral rites. No spear would fly, no sword would be drawn. The war, for a brief time, was suspended. Priam returned to the city with his son's body. The gates of Troy opened in silence. Men and women lined the streets, heads bowed. Andromache fell to the ground when she saw him, her hands pressed to her mouth, her hair unbound. Hecuba, the queen, tore her veil. Even Paris, for once, said nothing. Helen stood above them all, silent in her sorrow, and no one dared to blame her, for the grief in her eyes was deeper than any wound. The Trojans burned Hector with all the rites due to a prince. They built his pyre high and laid upon it fine robes and gold and weapons that would never see battle again. Priam lit the flame himself, and for 12 days the fires burned, and the weeping echoed through the city. No Greek crossed the plain, no Trojan looked over the walls. Even the gods, so long entangled in the threads of this war, held their peace. Hector was gone. Patroclus was gone. The greatest of the warriors had met and one had fallen. But this was not the end. Troy still stood. Achilles still breathed. And though the fires of mourning burned now, they would soon give way to blood once more. The death of Achilles and the battle for the armor. Achilles returned to the battle, but fate had already marked him. From the moment he stepped back onto the field, with the shield of peace on his arm and fire in his eyes, every god watching the war knew what would follow. Thetis had once tried to hide him from this destiny, disguising him, shielding him, even begging the immortals to spare her son. But Achilles chose glory, and glory is never granted without blood. It was Paris who struck the blow, but few called it a victory. The Prince of Troy, guided by Apollo, loosed an arrow from the walls, and the god steered it to its mark. It struck Achilles' heel, the one place untouched by the waters of the Styx, where Thetis held him as an infant. The arrow pierced the flesh, and the greatest of the Greeks fell. He did not die in the heat of battle, surrounded by foes, as many expected. He died beneath the gaze of the gods, with the dust slowly rising around him, and with the knowledge that his name would live, even as his body faded. The Greeks carried him from the field in silence. There was no rejoicing, only the sound of mourning, heavy and low. They burned him on a great pyre, as they had Patroclus, and mingled their ashes together. It was said their souls joined in death, as they had been in life. A mound was built upon the shore of Troy, so high that passing ships could see it and remember the rage and glory of the son of Thetis. With Achilles gone, the Greeks mourned not only a man, but the future they had envisioned with him. He was more than a warrior. He was their shield, their terror, their hope. Without him, the tide of the war shifted again. But there were those who still fought, and those who burned with rival flames. The armor of Achilles, forged by Hephaestus and now stained with his blood, became the prize. It was offered as an honor to the most deserving warrior remaining. 2 men claimed it: Ajax, the towering son of Telamon, strong and steady as a mountain, and Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca, whose words had won as many battles as his blade. A council of chiefs was called. They listened not to feats of strength, but to speeches. Odysseus spoke with elegance and memory, weaving the story of his service, reminding the Greeks of his cunning and his courage, of the night raids and ambushes, of the walls he had overcome and the men he had saved. Ajax spoke plainly, pointing to the shield he had carried alongside Achilles, to the wounds on his flesh, to the loyalty he had never questioned. But the Greeks chose Odysseus. Ajax did not protest. He left the camp and walked away into the night. But shame grew in him like a disease. In the darkness, his mind clouded. He saw enemies where there were none. He drew his sword and slaughtered a herd of cattle, believing them to be the men who mocked him. When the madness left him and he saw what he had done, he fell upon his own blade. Thus died the strongest of the Greeks, not by the spear of a Trojan, but by the weight of pride and the silence of despair. Others followed. Penthesilea, queen of the Amazons, came to Troy after Hector's death, seeking to honor his memory and test her strength. She rode into battle with the grace of a dancer and the fury of a storm. The Trojans cheered her, and for a brief time hope returned to their hearts. But Achilles had left a shadow, and none could escape it. Penthesilea met her death at the hands of a Greek, slain by Achilles' son Neoptolemus, who came to the war after his father's fall, carrying his rage as an inheritance. Then came Memnon, son of the goddess of the dawn, a prince from distant lands, tall and golden, with a spear like sunlight and a host of warriors behind him. He challenged the Greeks, and his presence inspired awe even among the enemy. But he too was destined to fall, slain in single combat. The gods wept for him. His mother Eos cried, and her tears fell to the earth as morning dew. One by one the heroes died. Names that once summoned songs now lay broken beneath the walls of Troy. The war no longer belonged to the heroes. It belonged to time and sorrow. The final prophecies. Neoptolemus and Heracles' bow. The plain before Troy was cross-hatched with blood so many times that the earth no longer remembered the green it once bore. Tombs rose beside the ships. Mounds of stone marked the dead, but there were never enough stones and never enough names. The war had burned so long that it ceased to be a fight for Helen or for honor. It became a burden neither side could put down. Even the gods, who once delighted in the intrigue and the pulling of fate's threads, now watched with a weary silence. And yet, there were still prophecies that needed to be fulfilled. Troy would not fall by might alone. Its doom was written in riddles. The Greeks, desperate for resolution, turned again to the seers. Calchas, the priest who had long served as the voice of Apollo in their camp, spoke of hidden truths that must be uncovered if the city was to fall. Troy was protected by not only its walls or its warriors, but by sacred relics and names bound by fate. Without fulfilling certain conditions, the city would never yield. These prophecies were not new, but they had been forgotten in the heat of the war. Now, with so many heroes dead and the siege drawn out into its final years, they were remembered again. The first was the requirement of Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles. It was foretold that the bloodline of the greatest warrior must return to Troy to complete what his father began. And so Odysseus and Phoenix sailed for Skyros, the island where Thetis had once hidden her son. They found Neoptolemus not a boy, but a youth already marked by the legacy he carried. He was not his father, but Achilles' shadow clung to him. He returned with them willingly, bearing new armor, eager to claim the place where his name was etched before his birth. When he arrived at Troy, the Greeks looked upon him with hope and dread, for it was said he would bring the war to an end, but that his hands would be stained by cruelty as well as glory. The second prophecy spoke of the Palladium, a sacred statue of Athena hidden within the city walls. As long as the Palladium remained in Troy, the city would never fall. It was a gift of the gods in ancient times, a symbol of divine protection. To steal it was to divest Troy of its soul. Odysseus, the eternal trickster, took up the task. With Diomedes by his side, they stole forth under the cover of night and climbed over the city walls. They found the statue hidden deep within the temple and lifted it from its pedestal. The theft was quiet, without bloodshed. But when the Trojans awoke to find it gone, they knew something had shifted. A part of the city had died in the dark, and though the walls still stood, they no longer had the blessings of the gods. The final piece of the prophecy spoke of a bow and a wound. The bow had once belonged to Heracles, the greatest of all heroes. It had been passed to Philoctetes, a warrior who sailed with the Greeks at the start of the war, but was abandoned on the island of Lemnos after the bite of a poisonous snake left his legs swollen and festering. The wound rotted, and his cries made the others leave him behind. Now, so many years later, the Greeks remembered him. Calchas declared that only the bow of Heracles could bring about the death of Paris, and that Troy's fate rested on his return. Odysseus sailed to the sea again. He found Philoctetes still alive, bitter and injured, his legs still smelling of rot, his mind filled with hatred for the men who had abandoned him. But he still had the bow, and he still remembered the taste of glory. It was Neoptolemus who softened his heart, not with lies, but with the truth. He told Philoctetes of the war, of the death of Achilles, of the heroes who had fallen, and of those who still fought. Slowly the fire returned to the old warrior's eyes. He agreed to return. The gods sent the sons of Asclepios, the healers, to cleanse the wound, and he took up the bow again. When they reached Troy, the sky was gray with prophecy. Paris stood upon the crenellated walls, bow in hand, his face still handsome and unchanging, but devoid of purpose. The man who had once crossed the sea to win Helen now stood like a phantom. In the battle that followed, Philoctetes loosed his arrow. Guided by fate and the wrath of Heracles, it struck Paris in the belly. He fell, not like a prince, but like a man who had long run out his story. He crawled into the forest to the home of Oenone, the nymph he had once abandoned. He begged her to heal him, as she once could, but she refused. He died in silence. And so, the man who started the war did not live to see its end. With the arrival of Neoptolemus, the disappearance of the Palladium, and the death of Paris, the final figures were settling into place. The Greeks stood on the edge of victory, but the walls of Troy still loomed, and inside were people who had not yet surrendered, women who still sang to their gods, and a city that had endured a 10-year siege. But prophecy, being fulfilled, does not rest. It waits until the final door is opened, and that door would soon come in the shape of wood and silence. The war was nearly done, but the final act, the cruelest and most cunning, had not yet begun.
The idea of cunning, the Trojan horse. The war had lasted so long that soldiers on both sides no longer remembered what peace felt like. Children were born within the walls of Troy who had never seen the world outside. The Greeks no longer counted the years since they first sailed from Aulis. The ships lined up along the beach were weathered by time, their sails patched, their hulls darkened by salt and sun. The fires in the Greek camp still burned, but they did so quietly, not with a roar of certainty, but with the slow, stubborn persistence of men who had given too much to turn back. The fighting had settled into a rhythm, like the tide or the changing of seasons. Some days brought blood, others brought silence. The Greeks no longer believed in a swift victory. The Trojans no longer believed in salvation. And the gods, once so active, now stood aloof, their attention drawn elsewhere. Perhaps they too had grown weary of the carnage. And yet Troy endured. Its walls, high and ancient, still towered over the plain. Its ramparts still held watch. Though Hector was gone, and Paris was gone, the city did not fall. Priam, aged and sorrowful, still ruled from his high palace. Aeneas still led men into battle. Deiphobus, Helenus, and the last princes of Priam's house still walked the halls. The heart of the city was not broken, not yet. Doubt began to grow among the Greeks. Men whispered that perhaps the gods had lied, that perhaps Troy could not fall. Some urged retreat, a slow sail home. Others dreamed of escape, but stayed out of shame, unwilling to admit they had given 10 years for nothing. It was in this fatigue, this desperation, that a new thought began to brew. It came not with trumpets or in dreams, but quietly in the tent of Odysseus. He had watched the war not just with a soldier's eyes, but with a hunter's patience. He had studied the city, listened to its messengers, and spoken with its captives. He knew the walls would not fall to strength, not even Achilles had breached them. And now, with the mightiest gone, no sword could do what needed to be done. But there was another weapon. The idea came slowly, and then with a rush. A trick, a deception so bold it would seem like madness, yet so elegant that it would outlive all the battles that came before it. Odysseus did not go to Agamemnon immediately. He spoke to Epeius, a builder and craftsman, known more for his tools than his temper. He told him what must be built: a gift, a hollow effigy, a horse great and gleaming, large enough to contain men, built not for war, but for worship. They would pretend it was a tribute, an offering to Athena, goddess of wisdom and war, a sign of retreat, a symbol of surrender. They would burn the camp, take down the tents, and sail away, leaving the horse as a farewell. The Trojan horse, the silent invasion. And when the Trojans came for their victory, they would find what seemed like a gift from their enemies and haul it into their walls. Inside the horse, soldiers would wait, silent, armed, hidden in wood and darkness. It was madness, it was genius, and it was their only remaining chance. Not all the Greeks agreed. Men like Menelaus hesitated. Others doubted it would work, but they were tired and they had tried everything else. Agamemnon gave his consent. The ships were readied, the fires were set, the illusion of retreat began, and the horse, tall and immobile, began to take shape on the shore. At dawn, the Greeks were gone. The beach that had once held 1,000 ships was empty. The ramparts were tumbled and smoldering, the trenches abandoned. Smoke drifted in the air where the cooking fires had burned. The sea was calm, the tide slow, and the great ships were gone, hidden behind the curve of the nearby island of Tenedos. On the shore, standing tall and strange amidst the ashes, only one thing remained. A huge wooden horse, built of smooth beams and carefully carved, loomed over the battlefield like a relic left by the gods. Its form was noble, its flanks rounded and silent, its face turned toward the city with no expression. The Trojans looked from their walls, first with suspicion, then with wonder. Scouts were sent out. There was no ambush. The Greeks did not stir. The camp was abandoned. Some cried that it was a trap. Others laughed and called it a miracle. They had waited 10 years for this day, and now, without warning, it had come. Priam, gray-haired and trembling, descended from his throne to walk among the ruins. His counselors argued. Some urged caution. One voice among them was raised with force. His name was Laocoon, a priest of Apollo, a man who had served the gods faithfully. He stood before the horse and cried out to the people, "Do not trust gifts left by your enemies. In the stillness there is treachery." He took his spear and hurled it at the flank of the wooden beast. It struck the side with a hollow sound, a drumbeat of danger. But the sound passed unheard by ears that no longer wanted to listen. At the same hour, a second sign arrived. A prisoner was dragged to the gates, beaten and bruised, claiming to have been abandoned by the Greeks. His name was Sinon. He was a skilled lyre, planted there by Odysseus. He told the Trojans a tale of betrayal, how the Greeks had turned against him and left him as a sacrifice. He said the horse was a gift to Athena, meant to protect the Greeks on their way home. If the Trojans dared to damage it, the goddess would curse them. If they brought it into the city, Troy would rise mightier than ever. His tears were persuasive. His voice rang with sorrow, and the people believed. Even the gods seemed to speak in favor of the deception. As Laocoon stood with his sons at the altar of Poseidon, 2 massive serpents rose from the sea. Their bodies were thick as ship masts, their eyes burning with divine fury. They coiled around Laocoon and his sons, crushed them, and dragged their bodies back into the surf. The people cried out that the gods had punished him for daring to strike a sacred gift. It was enough. The gates were opened. The Trojans wheeled the horse into the city. They cleared the streets, made space in the plaza, and hauled it through the Scaean gates, which had withstood every assault, but now welcomed the enemy cloaked in silence. The horse stood at the heart of Troy, looming over the temples and palaces. That night, the city filled with celebration. Wine flowed, music rose to the sky, and people danced beneath the stars. They believed the war was over. They believed the gods favored them. They believed they had endured. But inside the horse, the Greeks waited. Odysseus, Menelaus, Neoptolemus, Diomedes, all were cramped in the close silence, swords at their hips, listening to the distant sound of laughter. And beyond the horizon, the fleet sailed back under the cover of night. Troy slept, and the hour of its death drew near. The fall of Troy, the night of fire. Troy slept as it had not slept in years. For the first time in a decade,
The ramparts were unguarded and the walls unpatrolled. Warriors who had fought under the scorching sun now rested by their hearths. Mothers soothed children without fear. Old men drank wine in quiet courtyards, speaking of peace, of survival, of the day to come. The city had endured what no other had. It had survived the pride of Agamemnon, the rage of Achilles, the fall of Hector. The Greeks were gone, the beach was empty, and in the center of the city stood the great wooden horse, still and silent, a gift from vanished enemies. It seemed a fitting monument to a long and terrible war. But while Troy dreamed, the Greeks moved in the dark. They came from the sea. Oars plunged silently into the waves, sails down, torches muffled. The ships returned not with the roar of battle, but with the whisper of assassins. They landed again on the familiar shore where so many had died and been buried. They knew every curve of the coastline, every stone on the beach. There was no need for light. They could find their way by memory alone. Inside the wooden horse, the chosen warriors stirred. They had waited for hours in cramped silence, sweat clinging to their skin, weapons clutched in tired hands. Then, at last, the signal. Sinon, the lyre, the master of this quiet betrayal, crept from his hiding place and unlatched the belly of the beast. The wooden panel dropped, and Odysseus was the first to leap down onto the plaza. One by one the Greeks emerged, shadows among the torchlight, moving like ghosts through the sleeping streets. They opened the gates. The army poured into the city. No horns were sounded, no declaration was made. The war ended not with a shout, but with a whisper and a scream. The Greeks descended upon the city like fire. They spared no house, no altar, no bed. Children were torn from mothers. Old men were cut down as they knelt. Temples were sacked, statues broken, and altars stained with blood. The gods were forgotten in the chaos. Only rage remained. Priam, king of Troy, once proud, once noble, now frail and broken, was dragged to the altar of Zeus in his own palace. There he clung to the statue of the god, begging for mercy, invoking the laws of sanctuary. But Neoptolemus, the son of Achilles, showed no reverence. He slew the old man with a blade, staining the sacred stone with royal blood. In that moment, the last breath of the city seemed to leave its body. Hecuba, the queen, watched her husband die and said nothing, and Hector's widow Andromache was taken captive, her child ripped from her arms. Astyanax, the boy who once sat on his father's shoulders and laughed at the stars, was thrown from the walls of Troy lest he grow into a man who might seek vengeance. Helen, the face for whom the war was fought, stood by Menelaus and waited to be judged. He looked upon her, torn between hatred and longing, and eventually chose to take her back to Sparta. Whether she was a wife or a captive, no one could say. On every street the fire rose. Palace roofs tumbled inward. Towers crumbled. The wind carried the scent of smoke and the cries of the dying across the plain. The horse stood in the center, untouched, its purpose fulfilled. By dawn, the city that once rivaled the heavens in beauty and might was nothing more than a ruin of blackened stone and shattered dreams. Those who survived were taken as spoils. The rest were left in silence. The gods, once so deeply invested in the fates of men, now stood aloof, their temples in ash, their statues fallen. Perhaps they knew from the start that this was the end. Perhaps they never cared. Troy had fallen. Its songs would live on, but its walls would never rise again. The war was over. The heroes were dead. and all that remained was the long journey home.
The echoes and the long journey home. The fires of Troy burned for many days. Smoke coiled into the sky at dawn, as if the city was still screaming, even after its voice had been silenced. What took centuries to build was undone in a single night. Stone lay cracked and blackened. Statues melted under the heat, and the air was thick with the smell of ash, blood, and broken hope. The sound of weeping came not from the wounded, for most of them were dead, but from those who were taken captive, the women, the children, the elderly who had survived the sack only to face slavery. The Greeks wandered through the ruins not with triumph, but with the stunned silence of men who had given too much. Their armor was dented, their hands calloused, their faces gaunt. Many had come seeking glory, singing of conquest when they left their homes. But what they found at the end was silence and shadows. There were no parades, there was no peace. The gods had turned away. Among the captives was Andromache, Hector's widow. Her son had been thrown from the walls by Greek hands, and now she was dragged to the ships as a slave, a prize for Neoptolemus, the very man who had slain her husband's father at the altar. She did not cry out. She walked with her head held high, though her eyes no longer blinked. Hecuba, once queen of Troy, sat in chains beside her. Once cloaked in silk, she was now dressed in dust and bruises. Her sons dead, her city gone, her husband killed before her eyes. It was said her grief broke her mind, and in later years she no longer spoke to men, only to shadows. Cassandra was taken too. The cursed prophetess, daughter of Priam, had long warned her people of the doom to come. She had screamed that Paris would bring ruin, that the horse was a trap, that death would sweep through the streets in fire. No one listened. That was her curse, to see the truth and never be heard. When the Greeks found her at Athena's altar, she clung to the statue in a last plea for protection. But even the gods were no longer listening. She was dragged away by Ajax the Lesser. Her cries echoed in the shattered halls. For this crime, Athena turned her wrath against the Greeks, and the gods readied their punishments. Helen walked among the ashes like a ghost. She was the spark that ignited the flame, the reason men died, though no one could say what she truly desired. She had seen her first husband fall, her second betray, and 1,000 others perish for the shape of her face. Menelaus found her, finally, her beauty still luminous, though dimmed by sorrow. He looked into her eyes and saw not a seductress or a traitor, but a woman swept away by a storm much larger than herself. He took her hand, and together they walked back to the ships. Some say he forgave her, others say he never spoke a word. The Greeks loaded their ships with treasure, with women, with the spoils of a shattered city. They prepared to sail, to return to lands they had not seen in 10 years. But the winds would not carry them home easily. The gods had not forgotten the crimes committed, the violation of Cassandra, the murder of Priam at the altar, the desecration of the sacred temples. All of it had angered the immortals. The sea turned against them. Storms rose. Ships were wrecked. Men who had survived 10 years of war now drowned within sight of their homelands. Ajax the Lesser was struck by lightning as his ship smashed against the rocks. Agamemnon returned to Mycenae only to be murdered by his wife, Clytemnestra, and her lover who had ruled in his absence. Menelaus and Helen wandered for years before they found their way back to Sparta. And Odysseus, the cunning king of Ithaca,
would take another 10 years to return, wandering through storms and monsters, through the lands of witches and the islands of the dead. Not all the Greeks returned. Some settled in foreign lands, some founded new cities, some vanished into legend. The war was over, but the price had not yet been paid. The ghosts of Troy followed them. The songs they had once sung with pride now echoed with regret. Troy had fallen. The towers lay in the dust. The gods withdrew their gaze, but in every hearth across the Aegean, the stories were being told. Fathers whispered the names of fallen sons. Bards sang of Hector's last stand, Achilles' rage, Helen's beauty, and Cassandra's madness. They sang of the horse and the fire, of vengeance and betrayal. They sang of the city that once stood against the whole world and held it at bay. And now the tale is told. Rest now, for the walls of Troy have fallen. The heroes sleep in the quiet earth, and the sea is calm again. Good night.